You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, proving the doubters wrong. The Prime Minister defends Glasgow's climate summit, but were the promises made enough to keep 1.5 alive? After criticism of a weakened final deal, China says developed countries should take the lead in ending coal consumption. And President Biden will meet Xi Jinping later tonight. He'll press for further action from China on climate change. Hello there, a very good evening. After 2 weeks of intense negotiations, politicians, scientists and activists are assessing the impact of COP26. Amid criticism of a deal watered down by some of the biggest emitters, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has again defended the climate summit's achievements, saying the agreement settled on by all nations has proved the doubters wrong. This claim was challenged by the Labour leader in the House of Commons this afternoon. Let's have a listen to what they both said.
We have seen some countries that really should know better, dragging their heels about their Paris commitments. But if, not this one, but if, and it is still a massive if, they make good on their pledges, then I believe that Glasgow will be remembered as the place where we secured a historic agreement and the world began to turn the tide.
The summit was held back by the Prime Minister's guileless boosterism, which only served to embolden the big emitters. The Prime Minister praised inadequate net zero plans. He called the Australia plans heroic, even though their plan was so slow that it was in line with 4 degrees of global warming. By providing this cover, the Prime Minister had little chance of exerting influence over the other big emitters, and we saw many more disappointing national plans.
Well, joining me now to reflect on the promises made and what effect they might have is Mary Robinson, Chair of the Elders Independent Group of Global Leaders. Great to see you. We met right at the start of COP 2 weeks on. The Prime Minister says it was historic and game-changing. Sir Keir Starmer says it's a missed opportunity. Where do you stand?
Well, the Elders did deplore a lack of actual leadership before and at COP, in understanding that we can't be on course for a world of 2.4 degrees Celsius, which we still are. But I do think a lot of progress was made in a kind of global, messy way. That's the way the COP works, by consensus. For example, we doubled the climate adaptation finance, which is really important for countries. There were a number of side issues that were important, like the agreement on methane, which John Kerry takes a lot of credit for. Methane is dangerous in the short term. Cutting it can help us. And many countries pledged to that for the first time. We saw agreements on coal before the end point of downgrading the wording in the final closing decision. But we saw investment hugely turning to going green. So all of these things will help. And we saw an urgency, not in the leaders who should have seen that urgency, but in everybody else. The small island states, the indigenous peoples, the civil society, the young climate activists. They were the ones that kept me going, kept me lifted. I met so many of them and was so impressed by their determination. They're not going to give up. So I think going forward, the COP didn't achieve closing the gap. Probably we didn't think it would, but it kept alive the 1.5. And that is really important. It kept it alive with a big task on all communities. Now it goes to local level in every country. Every country has to do locally what it takes to achieve this transformative change, which will be good for people. It will be healthier. We won't have the fossil fuel. The cities will be much greener, much cleaner. We'll have farms in the cities because we'll have vertical farms. We'll have gardens in the cities. We'll have, the regenerative agriculture. All these things that were talked about at various side issues in COP have to come together.
Yeah, it's great to hear your positivity. That is fantastic. But there was disappointment as well, wasn't there? Especially in the wording of the final document. We know that India pushing hard to phase down, not phase out coal. What did you make of that?
Yeah. Well, it was very significant that phasing out of coal and out of fossil fuel subsidies was in the final document. We've never seen that before at previous COPs. So that was a big step. And then in many ways, we have to understand the different contexts of different countries. I have a lot of empathy for India, actually. I praised the commitment they made. Some people said it's only 2070 that they're going to commit to be out of coal and net zero. But actually, they're a huge country with very low per capita, problems. The emissions per capita of Indians are far, far lower than Europe and far, far lower than the United States. So let's get real here. India has a huge problem. It's gone solar a lot. It has very poor population. They depend on coal. If they go too fast, you'll have poverty of people. There are two kinds of subsidies on fossil fuel. The first is the production subsidy. That's the one we have to get rid of. Do you know what that is? That is, it's hard to believe. That is tax exemption. We tax exempt oil and gas companies. Stop doing that. And then there's the consumption subsidies, which is what we're talking about, where if we take those subsidies away, people won't be able to afford maybe food. They'll be in real poverty. So, we have to understand, and that's the value of a COP, that every side sees every side. And you saw the small island states very depressed about only, moving down on coal, not moving out, not phasing out, phasing down, not phasing out. But they also understand, and that's why we got agreement. And now we have to work forward, and that's the important thing.
OK, and of course, more commitments, hopefully in a year's time in Egypt. Great to get your thoughts.
Yes, we're ratcheting it up every year. That's so important.
Exactly. Mary Robinson, thank you very much indeed. OK, let's take a look at some of the day's other climate news now. And a YouGov poll for Sky News has found that while the majority of people questioned accept that the climate is changing because of human activity, the country is divided on how to tackle the issue. Only 2 in 5 people, or 44%, would support an increase in taxes to help solve climate change. 44% oppose that idea. 59% of people supported an increase to the cost of air travel, which 39% opposed. A low number of respondents also supported increases to the cost of gas, electricity, petrol, diesel, meat as well, with most people opposing that idea. Royal Dutch Shell has announced it is scrapping its dual share structure and moving its head office to Britain from the Netherlands. After being pushed away by Dutch taxes and climate pressure from courts, the company was recently ordered in court to slash its carbon emissions to protect the environment. A British environmental activist on a mission to end plastic waste has travelled to the headquarters of the maker of Tampax in Geneva to hand back plastic tampon applicators. Ella Daish made a giant applicator from 1,200, which she found littering UK beaches and waterways. She wants Procter & Gamble to stop using single-use plastic tampon applicators, which take hundreds of years to decompose. The company says it's working on finding solutions. Now, China has responded to criticism that it helped weaken the language on phasing out coal at the climate summit. China says when it comes to ending coal consumption, developed countries should take the lead and provide more support to developing nations. Well, the comments all come ahead of a meeting between President Biden and China's Premier Xi Jinping a bit later tonight.
We encourage developed countries to take the lead to stop using coal, and at the same time, we encourage developed countries to provide adequate funding, technology and capacity building support for the energy transition of developing countries. What we need is not only a slogan, but also concrete action.
Let's go straight to Washington, D.C., join our correspondent, Joe Pike. So, Joe, can President Joe Biden expect to get anything more out of China on the climate when the two men talk later?
Well, he certainly, Jonathan, has said he will bring up the issue of the environment at that bilateral meeting, only the third time the two leaders have met. And clearly they are both very significant actors in trying to tackle climate change. But we should also point out relations between the two countries are strained, they are tense. And whilst the environment may be on the agenda, it will not be at the top of the agenda, or probably that close to the top. Other issues we expect to be discussed include trade, cybersecurity, nuclear non-proliferation, and perhaps Taiwan as well. And it has been really fascinating to listen to the sort of change in tone in previous weeks, both countries talking about their relations and their approach to the environment in different ways. Certainly at the start of COP, of course, Joe Biden was very critical of Xi Jinping not turning up, saying that that was a big mistake. The Chinese negotiator obviously responding by saying, well, some countries, of course, did respond, pull out of previous COPs, previous climate commitments, and not, of course, to Donald Trump, the Paris Accords in 2015. And of course, yet again, as you mentioned with Mary Robinson, there was that watering down on the issue of coal. But China do say that they have done a lot on this issue. Some, of course, would maybe critique that. We've also heard today from John Kerry. He's been visiting Paris, and he is the US's climate envoy. This is what he said. An optimistic message, I think, from John Kerry in relation to the relations between the two countries over climate. In the agreement we forged with China, he said, this is the surprise agreement between the two countries in the final days of COP, which no one believed was possible, even in the midst of the conflict we have over other issues. We did negotiate an agreement where China specifically agreed that they will next year, before COP27 in Egypt, submit an ambitious national action plan to deal with methane. But as we saw in that clip from the Chinese government, Jonathan, the Chinese believe that developed countries need to play their part as well.
OK, Joe, in Washington for us, thank you very much indeed for that. Do stay with us. Coming up after this short break, I'll be joined by author and presenter Zaya Tong and Tom Rivett-Carnac, co-founder of Global Optimism, a climate podcaster and an author as well. We'll be speaking to them in a moment, discussing all the fallout from COP26, of course, and if it's time to change the way climate negotiations are done. We'll see you in a minute. Hello again, welcome back to the Daily Climate Show here on Sky News, and we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day with author and presenter Zaya Tong and Tom Rivett-Carnac, co-founder of Global Optimism. He was also chief political strategist at the UN Climate Change Convention for the Paris Agreement back in 2015. Well, the Glasgow Climate Pact, as it's now been called, has of course provoked differing reactions, as we've been hearing. Progress certainly, but limited. Great to see you both. Thanks for being with us. Tom, perhaps we can start with you. As I was saying, you were heavily involved in creating the Paris Agreement in 2015. Do you think the Glasgow Climate Pact has moved things on significantly?
Well, it's definitely moved things on. I mean, significantly is the difficult part of your question there, but I would argue that it has. Paris set in motion a process that would decarbonize the economy over multiple decades with these really important waypoints where countries come back to the table and they make renewed commitments to keep us in line with our ultimate objective of staying within 1.5 degrees. Now, what we saw in Glasgow was a big step forward. At Paris, we may have been committed to 1.5, but we were heading for more than 4. Coming out of Glasgow, if you add up the national commitments, it's 2.4 degrees. If you look at some of the pledges, it could be as little as 1.8. Now, that's clearly not enough, and it needs to go further and faster. But it did take us a long way towards where we need to go. And when combined with the agreement that countries will come back to the table in 12 months' time with new commitments, I think 1.5 is still very much on the table.
Yeah, what do you make of that, Zaya? I mean, we're still a long way off from 1.5, but in a year's time, we'll be discussing it all again. We'll be forcing those countries, won't we, that aren't doing enough to really look at themselves.
Well, I think that when you have the president, Alok Sharma of COP, actually reduced to tears at the end of the conference and saying that it's a deep disappointment, it's very difficult to claim that this is a success by any measure, especially because the UN actually had 3 criteria for success. One, that we would actually see a 50% reduction in CO2 by 2030. Second, that we would see the $100 billion in payment from rich to poor countries. And third, that 50% of that would go toward adaptation. All 3 criteria were not met. So I think you can dance around the margins and pretend that this was a success, but in truth, it wasn't.
Well, Tom, that's pretty damning, isn't it? What do you make of that?
Well, I can understand precisely what she's saying. I mean, this is disappointing, right? We need to go further and faster. But I would just say within the confines of multilateralism, which is incredibly difficult, very frustrating, nobody gets what they want at the end of the day. These things are always disappointing. When we were putting the Paris deal together, we jokingly used to say that the thing we were aiming for was for everybody to be equally disappointed. Now, at the end of the day, what we've come out of here is a hard-won agreement out of Glasgow. I would argue that with the commitments in place, with the additional step up, that gives us a pathway to get to where we want to be. Does it guarantee we'll deliver it? Absolutely not. Is the possibility of failure still on the table? Of course it's still there. Do China and India and every other country need to step up further and go further? Yes, absolutely they do. But what we've seen, I would say, is some elements of this agreement that are significant. I mean, we're now talking about 1.5 as a threshold. We're now talking about renewed finance for adaptation, new commitments from national countries, some transformative commitments on forests and methane and coal. Some of those have gaps in them. And of course, you can chuck rocks. Is it enough? Absolutely not. Will I take it as a step in a process that unfolds over multiple years to get us to where we need to go that's inevitably going to be slower than we would want to? I would say, actually, it does take us forward.
OK, Zai, let's talk about some of those things then. Some of the more positive things that came out of Glasgow. Tom mentioned deforestation there, for example. More than 100 countries have pledged to end deforestation by 2030. A similar pledge was made in 2014, of course. Nothing came of that. Surely this time something really can fundamentally happen.
Well, I want to start by saying that I don't want to come across as doom and gloom. I am typically doom and gloom, but I do want to say that this New York deforestation pledge that came out 7 years ago, what did it result in? Well, there was a 2019 study that actually looked at the results, and it found that ever since that pledge, we've seen a 41% increase in deforestation. Our deforestation rates have increased to the equivalent of one United Kingdom every single year. So pledges are not performance. And when we look at COVID, for instance, we started seeing that people were wearing masks, restaurants changed their hours or their opening behaviors or what have you. Things physically changed. If we're actually looking at deforestation, we would need to see robust measures. For example, whether it is, let's say, publishing companies not using trees, instead using ebooks, instead of using toilet paper, people starting to use bidets, instead of, for example, the old growth forest being logged in places like British Columbia, instead of using bioenergy and forests for fuel. All of these things would actually change, and they would be on the table if we were having a real discussion. Another thing that's really critical to keep in mind is in these discussions of language that we've been having, they're incredibly, incredibly weak. I want you to picture, for example, if we had had 26 years of conferences on lung cancer and we were not able to use the word cigarette. That is exactly what is happening here. 26 years of COP, and we cannot use the words oil and gas. Something is very wrong here. I would use the F word, and the F word is feckless.
OK, it's a good word. I wonder what word you were going to use then, but feckless I will take.
I know you were.
Tom, I suppose one of the issues here is that really, if we're going to do this and we're going to do it quickly enough, we need systemic change. We need a huge amount of effort from everybody right around the world. And we've done a poll today which says that 40% of UK people support raising taxes to reduce carbon emissions. Only 40%. Now, that's not going to be enough, is it? It's down to you, it's down to me to make changes, surely, in order to reach these commitments. Otherwise, COP26 just does become a talking shop.
Well, I thought that was a very interesting statistic when you guys put it out, that 40% would support raising taxes. I mean, I agree that that's an interesting number. I wonder how you ask that question is going to lead to a different outcome. I think actually what we need to do is shift the tax base so that we stop taxing things that we want in our economy, like employment, and we stop taxing things that we don't want, like pollution. And actually that shifting can be revenue neutral. So I think there's a lot in how you ask the question, but the core of what you described there is actually that we need systemic change. And I'd like to just go back to the previous point you made, because it's a really great example. In 2014, a group of countries came together and made this New York Declaration on Forests that everybody was very enthusiastic about. But the truth is, it was kind of thin, right? It was a statement from countries. There was no implementation plan. And so as a result, inevitably in Glasgow, when a similar looking type of commitment comes out, everybody says, this is meaningless. You said this 7 years ago. You didn't do it. It went up by 41%. How come you're lying? But actually, if you dig under the skin of this commitment, not only is it 100 countries committing to reversing deforestation by 2030, it's also real money on the table to the tune of 20 billion.
I'm so sorry. We are out of time, but it's been great listening to your thoughts. Tom Rivett-Carnac and Zaya Tong, thank you both very much.